rain fell without mercy, drenching the palace courtyard as though the sky itself had passed judgment. It washed over stone, steel, and fear alike, blurring the line between justice and cruelty. At the center of it all, Seraphina knelt, small before the towering pillars of power, yet unbroken. Her knees pressed into the cold ground, her hair heavy with rain, her heart splintering with every second that passed. Beyond her, the sentence had already been spoken. Treason. Death. Her family's fate hovered only moments away from being sealed in blood. Seraphina had known this moment would come long before the accusation was ever voiced. In royal courts, innocence was fragile, and truth was a currency often outbid by ambition. Her family had been chosen not because they were guilty, but because they were convenient. And so, when the execution order was raised, she did not scream or beg. She rose into the storm with resolve carved from desperation and love, stepping forward where no one like her had ever dared. The tribunal had been absolute until she broke it. In a move that shattered protocol and stunned the court into silence, Seraphina offered what no one expected and no one could ignore. She offered herself, not as a plea, not as a bargain, but as a binding vow: marriage to the Alpha King. The rain seemed to pause in disbelief as the weight of her proposal spread through the courtyard. Gasps rippled through nobles and warriors alike. This was not merely improper, it was dangerous. A common-born woman kneeling before the most powerful Alpha alive, tying her fate to his throne in front of witnesses, challengers, and enemies. It was a political earthquake, and one that threatened to fracture the balance of the realm. And at the center of that fracture stood King Lucian Nightborn. The moment Seraphina made her offer, something ancient and violent stirred within him. The bond struck without warning, sharp, consuming, undeniable. It surged through blood and bone, roaring recognition where there should have been none. Lucian felt it instantly, the pull of a connection older than crowns and stronger than law. Yet his face betrayed nothing. Years of rule had forged restraint into armor, and he locked the reaction away where no one could see it. Not the council, not the court, and certainly not the woman kneeling before him. To reveal the bond now would be to ignite chaos, so he did what kings did best. He chose control. When Lucian accepted Seraphina's proposal beneath the storm, it was with a calm that masked the wildfire already spreading through him. With that acceptance, the execution was halted, the accusation suspended, and the court forced to reckon with a future it had not planned. The rain bore witness as a vow was sealed. One born not of romance, but of sacrifice and fate colliding too soon. Slowly the courtyard emptied. Whispers replaced thunder. Allies recalculated. Enemies smiled behind lowered eyes. And when the last of the crowd dispersed, when the echoes of judgment faded into the rain-soaked stone, Lucian finally allowed himself to truly look at Seraphina. Not as a petitioner, not as a shield for her family, but as his future queen. And in that moment, with the storm still raging and the bond screaming for acknowledgement, Lucian realized the truth he could no longer deny. The connection between them was not waiting to be tested. The bond was already burning out of control, and then it was touched. The moment Lucian's hand closed around Seraphina's wrist, the storm outside began to fade, but the one between them exploded. Power surged through that single point of contact, ancient and possessive, awakening something that had no patience for denial. It was not gentle. It was not subtle. It was recognition in its rawest form, a force that demanded to be acknowledged even as Lucian forced it down beneath layers of discipline and crown-forged restraint. He guided her into the palace not as a lover, but as a king escorting a consequence he could not undo. Inside the walls of Nightborn Keep, the air changed. The rain no longer softened the world. It sharpened it. Shadows clung to marble corridors, and every step forward carried Seraphina deeper into a realm where loyalty was rare and mercy was strategic. She had crossed a threshold far more dangerous than the tribunal. By offering herself to the Alpha King, she had entered a den where smiles hid fangs and silence was often fatal. Seraphina understood this instinctively. She had never come seeking affection or fantasy. Love had never been part of the equation. What she wanted, what she needed was survival, for her family, for herself. Yet when the palace doors closed behind her, the strength that had carried her through the courtyard began to fracture. Alone with the weight of what she had done, the cost pressed in. The vow she had made under the rain echoed louder now, no longer protected by spectacle or urgency. The composure she wore so well cracked in the quiet. Above them, within the heart of the palace, the royal council gathered like circling vultures. News of the proposal spread faster than fire through dry brush, and suspicion followed immediately. They did not see courage. They saw calculation. A woman bold enough to bind herself to the throne in public was, to them, either dangerously clever or deliberately placed. They questioned her timing, her origins, her intentions, and most of all, her influence. Whispers began to coil through the corridors. Some said Seraphina was a spy, planted to weaken the king from within. Others claimed she was a seductress, using desperation as a mask to ensnare Lucian through the bond. Worse rumors followed, suggestions that she was not merely a woman at all, but a weapon shaped by prophecy, meant to control or destroy the Alpha King himself. Lucian heard every whisper, and instead of retreating, he advanced. With a decision that shattered any illusion of caution, Lucian moved the kingdom forward at a pace no one could stop. He announced that the wedding would not be delayed, debated, or negotiated. There would be no time for schemes to mature, no space for opposition to organize. The crown would bind Seraphina to the throne immediately, sealing her fate and his before the court could sharpen its knives. The declaration sent shockwaves through allies and enemies alike. Those who supported him hesitated, those who opposed him recalculated, and those who feared what Seraphina represented felt the first true stirrings of panic. Because once she was crowned, she would no longer be removable. Not openly, not lawfully. If from the deepest shadows of the palace, unseen eyes watched the king and his chosen queen move through the halls together. Calculations were made, orders were formed, and long before the crown could touch Seraphina's head, a decision was sealed in darkness. She would not be allowed to become queen. Her removal would be quiet, immediate, and final. That decision moved through the palace like a held breath, unseen but suffocating. On the night before the wedding, the keep stood unnaturally still, as though the walls themselves were listening. Seraphina felt it long before danger revealed itself. Alone within the royal chambers, she became acutely aware of the silence pressing in around her, of the way shadows seemed to stretch and gather where they should not. The air carried intention, and in that quiet, she knew she was no longer merely watched. She was being hunted. The attempt came swiftly, precise, and merciless, designed to end her before dawn could arrive. It was not rage that guided it, but calculation, a clean solution to an inconvenient future. But the bond did not sleep. It flared violently, tearing through restraint and distance alike, calling to Lucian with a force that could not be ignored. He arrived like judgment itself, unleashing a response so decisive it left no room for doubt or mercy. The threat was ended in moments, erased with lethal authority that spoke clearly to anyone still listening. Seraphina Nightborn was under his protection. The palace woke to blood and consequence. Instead of unity, the court fractured further. Fingers pointed not at the traitor, but at the woman who had survived. Voices rose, not claiming her presence had already destabilized the kingdom. They said the attack proved what they had feared, that she was a catalyst for chaos, a disruption the throne could not afford. Her survival was framed not as fortune, but as further evidence that something about her did not belong. Lucian answered them without hesitation. He stood before the court and claimed responsibility, cutting through accusation with the authority of the crown. He did not allow her name to be stained in public, nor her courage to be questioned. His defense was absolute, his stance unyielding. To challenge Seraphina was to challenge him, and the room felt the weight of that truth settle heavily over every whisper and glance. Yet behind closed doors, reality sharpened. Lucian did not offer her comforting illusions. He spoke of the royal pack as it was, ruthless, patient, and unforgiving. Trust, he made clear, was a luxury rarely afforded within palace walls. Loyalty shifted with power, and even those who bowed lowest could carry knives behind their backs. Survival here required vigilance, not faith. Seraphina listened, and something inside her shifted. For the first time, she began to understand the depth of her position, not just as a political figure, but as a force. The court's fear was not imagined. The whispers, the hostility, the violence, They were reactions to the effect she had already begun to have on the Alpha King. Her influence over Lucian was real, undeniable, and dangerous in ways she had never intended. She had come seeking safety, but instead she had altered the balance of power itself, and the bond continued to deepen. And with every passing hour it pressed closer, awakening emotions Lucian had buried beneath years of command and solitude. The connection stirred protectiveness that bordered on fury, attachment that defied reason, and a pull toward Seraphina that no crown or council could restrain. What had begun as restraint now required effort. What had been denial now strained toward acceptance. As the night gave way to dawn, the palace prepared for a wedding born of storm and survival. Seraphina rose, steady once more, and moved toward the altar where her future waited. She did not see the ancient symbols stirring unseen, nor feel the shift awakening deep within her bloodline. She walked forward unaware that the prophecy, long silent, long dismissed, had begun to breathe again. As Seraphina stepped into the ceremonial grounds, the world seemed to hold its breath with her. The palace stood radiant in anticipation, banners lifted high, torches lining the stone in solemn symmetry. Yet above it all, the moon burned an unnatural red, casting a glow that did not belong to any ordinary night. Those who noticed felt unease coil in their chests, though few dared to name it. This was meant to be a union of necessity. The sky had other intentions. The ceremony began beneath that crimson light, every movement steeped in tradition older than memory. As Seraphina moved closer to the throne, the ancient runes carved into the palace stone began to stir. One by one, they ignited with a low, resonant glow, reacting not to the crown, nor to the king, but to her. A visible tremor rippled through the elders. These symbols had lain dormant for generations, responding only to bloodlines woven into the foundation of the realm itself. The truth could no longer be ignored. Whispers turned frantic as fragments of an old prophecy resurfaced, dragged from forgotten texts and forbidden lore. A queen bound not merely by marriage but by fate. A woman whose presence could either secure the throne beyond challenge or reduce the kingdom to ruin. The realization spread like wildfire. Seraphina had never been an ordinary offering. She was a convergence of power, choice, and destiny, and Lucian saw it. In that moment, clarity cut through every doubt he had carried. Seraphina was not a pawn to be positioned or sacrificed for political balance. She had been drawn here by forces far older than the crown he wore. The bond he felt was no accident, no weakness. It was alignment, recognition, and the restraint he had clung to fractured under the weight of that understanding. Then the court moved. What had been celebration twisted into chaos as enemies revealed themselves from within the crowd. The fear Seraphina inspired turned to action, coordinated, ruthless, and swift. The palace erupted into panic as violence tore through ceremony and splendor alike, the air filled with shouts, steel, and the unmistakable scent of betrayal. This was not an attempt to disrupt a wedding, it was an attempt to end a prophecy. Lucian answered without hesitation. In full view of the court and beneath the watching moon, he stepped into his truth. Power rolled from him in waves as he claimed Seraphina, not just as queen, but as his chosen mate. The declaration carried the force of law and instinct intertwined, silencing doubt and drawing a line no traitor could mistake. The bond flared openly at last, no longer contained, no longer denied. The fight was brief, brutal, and costly. When the last of the attackers fell, the palace steps bore the price of defiance. Blood streaked the stone, vivid against the white marble, as the sky finally broke. Rain returned, cold and relentless, washing down banners, bodies, and shattered illusions alike. In its midst, Seraphina swayed. The power awakened within her surged too fast, too fiercely, colliding with shock and loss. Her strength faltered as the world tilted, and she collapsed into Lucian's arms, the red moon fading above them as the rain soaked them both. The vows had been spoken, and they had been written in blood. And in their aftermath, Seraphina woke to thunder inside her. It was not the sound of the storm outside the palace walls that pulled her back from darkness, but the echo of power rolling through her veins. It moved like distant lightning, measured yet relentless, awakening something that had slept for generations. When her awareness returned, the world felt sharper, heavier, as though she were standing at the center of a gathering storm only she could feel. The truth became impossible to deny. What had surfaced during the ceremony was not a momentary reaction, but the beginning of an awakening. Seraphina's blood carried an ancient inheritance, one intertwined with the royal line itself, older than Lucian's crown, older than the laws that governed the Pax. She was not merely bound to the throne through marriage or bond. She was bound by lineage long hidden, when her existence woven into the kingdom's forgotten foundations. Lucian felt the shift as clearly as she did. The bond between them deepened into something vast and volatile, resonating with her rising power. Instinct urged him to shield her, to contain the storm until it could no longer threaten her life. Yet another truth pressed just as fiercely. The force within Seraphina could not be caged without breaking her. To protect her might mean denying her strength. To unleash her strength might mean exposing her to a realm that would never stop trying to claim or destroy her. The Alpha King stood at the fault line between devotion and duty. Around them, the council fractured under the weight of recent bloodshed. Allegiances that had once appeared solid crumbled in the open. Those who had remained silent were no longer innocent. And those who had spoken in defense revealed deeper motives. Betrayals were confirmed not through confession, but through absence. Through who did not stand where loyalty demanded. The palace, once unified by fear of the crown, now reeled with exposed divisions. In the midst of that reckoning, the final truth surfaced. Seraphina learned that her family's accusation of treason had never been about crime or politics. It had been a lure, a carefully constructed snare designed to draw her into the open, to force her into a position where the bond, the prophecy, and her bloodline could no longer remain hidden. Her family had been chosen not as enemies of the crown, but as bait. The knowledge cut deep, but it did not break her. For the first time since kneeling in the rain, Seraphina was given a choice unshaped by desperation. She could flee, disappear before the storm within her grew too large to contain. Many would have taken that path, seeking safety and distance. But as she stood within the heart of the palace, feeling the kingdom shift beneath her feet, she understood something fundamental. Running would only delay the inevitable. Instead, she chose the throne, not as a sacrifice, not as a shield, but as a queen who would stand beside the Alpha King and face what she had awakened. The bond between them settled into something steadier, no longer only a force of instinct, but of shared resolve. Beyond the palace walls, that resolve was already being challenged. News of Seraphina's power spread quickly, carried by fear and ambition alike. And before the council could regain control, a declaration rang across the borders of the realm. A rival Alpha stepped forward, claiming that power of such magnitude did not belong to a single king or his queen. It belonged to the realm, and he was willing to go to war to take it. The rival Alpha's declaration did not linger as a threat. It moved as command. Borders hardened, banners rose. Pax chose sides with a speed born of fear and opportunity, and the kingdom trembled beneath the weight of old grudges awakened by the promise of power. The realm had not seen war of this scale in generations, and the air itself seemed charged with anticipation and dread. Lucian stepped onto the battlefield as the Alpha King he had been forged to become. His presence alone shifted the tide. Power radiated from him in waves, ancient and absolute, his eyes glowing with a promise of ruin to any who would challenge his claim. And this was not the restrained ruler of council chambers and ceremony. This was the apex predator of the realm, unbound by diplomacy, answering threat with annihilation. The clash that followed tore through land and sky alike. Steel rang, earth split, and the howls of warriors carried across the fields as the kingdom's fate was fought in blood and fury. Each side pressed forward, knowing retreat would mean extinction. Yet amid the chaos, one truth refused to remain hidden. Seraphina would not stay behind. While advisors urged secrecy and safety, she moved where she was needed most, among the vulnerable, the displaced, and the wounded. The power within her answered instinct rather than command, unfolding in protective surges that shielded civilians from destruction. Storm and light bent around her presence, not as weapons, but as guardians. Yet in those moments it became clear that her strength was not born for conquest, it was born for preservation. Lucian felt her choice through the bond, sharp and resolute. Fear for her safety collided with something stronger, pride. And in that convergence, the final barrier within him shattered. No longer did he restrain the full depth of his authority. he unleashed it. The Alpha King's wrath was decisive and merciless. Enemies fell back as his power carved through opposition, his dominance forcing submission where resistance had once stood. This was not cruelty, it was finality, a declaration written in force that the throne, and the queen who stood beside it, would not be taken. And beside him, Seraphina rose fully into herself. The bonds synchronized them, instinct and intention aligning seamlessly. They moved as one force, when not mirroring each other, but completing what the other began. Where Lucian struck, she fortified. Where she protected, he eradicated. Their unity turned the tide of battle, transforming chaos into inevitability. In the midst of victory, the final betrayal surfaced. The architect behind the war was not found among enemy ranks, but within Lucian's own inner circle. Someone trusted, positioned close enough to shape decisions and leak secrets. The revelation struck with the sharpness of truth long denied. This war had been engineered not just to claim Seraphina's power, but to weaken the throne from within. The traitor was exposed, their influence severed, and the rival Alpha's forces collapsed soon after. The battlefield fell silent beneath a sky heavy with aftermath. The enemy was defeated. The kingdom stood. And yet, as the dust settled and the bond between Lucian and Seraphina steadied, a lingering unease remained. The prophecy had not ended. Its final line, still unfulfilled, waited in the quiet, promising that the greatest choice had yet to be made. Then the rain returned. It did not fall with the fury that once drenched the palace courtyard or the violence that had washed blood from marble steps. This rain came softly, almost reverently, as Seraphina stood where she had once knelt. The same stones lay beneath her feet, the same sky above, but everything else had changed. The storm that had shaped her fate had passed, leaving behind a kingdom breathing again. In the days that followed the war, healing began where fear had ruled. Borders reopened, packs returned to their lands. The palace, once a place of whispered danger, became a seat of renewal. And one by one the council gathered, not to debate, not to resist, but to kneel. Their submission was not forced by power or prophecy, but by acknowledgement. Seraphina had proven herself not through conquest, but through protection, resolve, and choice. She was recognized as queen. Yet even as the crown settled into place, Lucian did something no Alpha King before him had ever dared. He offered her freedom, not as a test, not as a performance, but as truth. She could rule beside him, bound by bond and crown, or she could walk away unclaimed, unchained by fate or fear. The choice was hers alone, untouched by duty or destiny. It was the final threshold of the prophecy. And Seraphina stepped through it without hesitation. She chose love, not as sacrifice, but as alignment. Not because she was bound to stay, but because she wanted to. When in that decision, the prophecy unraveled, its power dissolving into quiet inevitability. What had been written as a curse revealed itself as a question all along, one that could only be answered freely. The bond shifted with her choice. No longer volatile or consuming, it settled into something enduring, a promise instead of a weapon, a connection no longer driven by fear of loss or hunger for control, but by trust that had been earned in storm and silence alike. As the rain continued to fall, Seraphina lifted her gaze to the sky that had once witnessed her surrender. This time, it did not bear her tears or desperation. It crowned her destiny instead, sealing a journey that had begun in fear and ended in sovereignty. She had said yes under the rain to save others. This time, she said yes to love. And though the world now stood at peace, one truth remained unshaken. The Alpha King would still burn the world for her,